Okay, let's go. Number 1. Carthage. The year is 146 BCE. You're standing on the walls of the greatest commercial city in the Mediterranean world, and the sky behind you is on fire. Roman legions are pouring through breaches in the harbor defenses, street by street, house by house, and they are not here to win, they are here to erase. For 17 days the fires burn. When they finally die, a city of 500,000 people, a civilization 600 years in the making, will be reduced to ash and a Roman decree. This is Carthage, and its destruction is not a tragedy of war. It is the first recorded act of deliberate cultural extermination in Western history, planned in a foreign senate, and carried out with the cold efficiency of an invoice. Carthage was founded around 814 BCE by Phoenician settlers from Tyre, on the coast of what is now Tunisia. Within a few centuries, it controlled the western Mediterranean so completely that Rome barely existed as a footnote. Its harbor, the Kothan, could berth 220 warships. Its fleets carried silver from Spain, tin from Britain, grain from Sicily. 500,000 people lived behind walls 13 feet thick and over 30 feet high, the Romans noticed. 3 Punic Wars ground on for over a century. Hannibal crossed the Alps with war elephants and nearly broke Rome in its own streets. Rome survived, but it did not forget. The senator Cato the Elder ended every speech he ever gave, on every subject, regardless of the topic at hand, with the same 4 words, Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. In 149 BCE, Rome found its excuse. The final siege lasted 3 years. When Scipio Aemilianus broke through in the spring of 146, the killing went house to house through a city built 6 stories high. The Greek historian Polybius, who was there, described soldiers dragging the living and the dead alike into the streets with hooked poles. 50,000 survivors were sold into slavery. The city was systematically demolished, not looted, demolished. Then came the part that makes Carthage different from every other ancient conquest. The ground was cursed and, according to Roman tradition, sown with salt so nothing would ever grow there again. Whether the salting literally happened remains debated, but the intent is not. Rome did not want a defeated Carthage. It wanted no Carthage at all. The Punic language was driven into extinction within a generation. The Carthaginian libraries, which Pliny says were distributed to African client kings, vanished completely. Of all their literature, their science, their navigational knowledge of the Atlantic coast, almost nothing survives, and what does comes filtered through the pens of their enemies. Modern excavation has confirmed the scale. Archaeologist Lawrence Stager's work on Bursa Hill uncovered a destruction layer of burned debris nearly a meter thick, the carbonized signature of those 17 days. A city bigger than any in contemporary Europe turned to a stratum of ash thinner than your hand. Beneath later Roman construction lie the foundations of the Punic city, sealed under the burn layer like a wound someone chose to pave over. The standard explanation is ruthless but logical. This was the brutal endpoint of an existential rivalry. Rome eliminated a competitor, absorbed its territory, and planted a Roman colony on the site a century later. Ancient empires conquered, absorbed, and moved on. Carthage simply lost the last round, but that doesn't explain the totality of the policy. Rome conquered Greece in the same decade and treasured Greek culture, copied it, taught it in Roman schools. It absorbed Egypt and kept its temples lit. With Carthage alone, the policy was annihilation. Not assimilation, annihilation. They didn't just beat a civilization. They tried to delete it from the record, and they very nearly succeeded. Everything we think we know about Carthaginian religion, their government, their gods, their daily life, comes from Romans and Greeks, describing an enemy they had every incentive to slander. We are reading a civilization through the testimony of the men who burned it. The accusations of child sacrifice, the synonym for treachery that is still called Punic faith, the legacy of Carthage as a monster in a children's story, all of it written by the victors, none of it checkable against a single Carthaginian source. What did Carthage actually know about the world that died in those 17 days? How much of what we believe about them is propaganda composed over the embers? And how many other civilizations in this video do we know only through the words of the people who erased them? The salt may be a legend, the silence is not. Number 2. The Hittites. The year is 1274 BCE. You're standing in a war chariot on the plain of Kadesh in modern Syria, and across the river the greatest army Egypt has ever fielded is forming up under the personal command of Ramesses II. You are not afraid. You command an empire stretching across Anatolia and into the Levant, with iron weapons while your enemies still use bronze, with fortified mountain capitals and a diplomatic reach that treats the pharaoh as an equal. You are a Hittite, and here is what should disturb you. 3,000 years from now, the civilization you are defending will have vanished so completely that the Bible, the most read book in history, will remember your people as a minor local tribe, barely worth a footnote. For most of recorded history, the Hittites were a ghost. They appear in the Hebrew scriptures as little more than a handful of names. No Greek historian remembered them as a great power. No Roman writer placed them alongside Egypt and Babylon. For over 3 millennia, one of the 4 superpowers of the Bronze Age simply fell out of the human story entirely. Their capital was Hattusa, a fortress city in the highlands of central Turkey, ringed by walls over 6 miles in circumference, guarded by monumental gates carved with lions and sphinxes. The empire controlled most of Anatolia and northern Syria, fielding armies of thousands of chariots. At Kadesh, an estimated 5,000 to 6,000 chariots clashed on a single plain. Neither empire broke the other. The largest chariot battle in history ended in a draw. What followed is the oldest surviving peace treaty in the world. The Treaty of Kadesh, negotiated around 1259 BCE between the Hittite king Hattusili III and Ramesses, was carved in stone in both Egyptian hieroglyphs and Akkadian cuneiform. A reproduction hangs at the United Nations headquarters in New York today. These were not barbarians on the fringe of civilization. They were master diplomats and metallurgists, among the first peoples on Earth to work iron at scale, a technology advantage that would not spread widely for another 1,000 years. Then around 1200 BCE, it came apart. The late Bronze Age collapse swept the eastern Mediterranean like a wave. Cities burned from Greece to the Levant. Trade networks that had sustained civilizations for centuries shattered in a generation. Hattusa was abandoned and torched. The Hittite Empire dissolved so completely that within a few generations almost no one alive remembered it had ever existed. The language died with the last people who spoke it. Rediscovery came by accident. In 1834, a French traveler named Charles Texier stumbled on Hattusa's ruins without knowing what he had found. The real breakthrough came in 1906 when the German archaeologist Hugo Winkler excavated at Bogoskoy and pulled 30,000 cuneiform tablets from the earth, the entire administrative archive of a lost empire. In 1915, the Czech scholar Bedřich Hrozný proved Hittite was Indo-European, related to Greek, Latin, Sanskrit, and the English you are reading now. An empire erased from history turned out to be a linguistic ancestor of the civilization that forgot it. The standard explanation for the disappearance is the system's collapse model. Drought, famine, earthquakes, migrating sea peoples, and the cascading failure of interdependent trade networks brought down every major power simultaneously. The Hittites, dependent on imported grain and extended supply lines through rough terrain, were more fragile than their military reputation suggested. When the system failed, they failed with it. But that doesn't explain the forgetting. Egypt collapsed in the same catastrophe and endured in human memory for millennia. Babylon fell repeatedly and survived in every chronicle. The Hittites alone dropped out so completely that an empire which negotiated as a peer with the pharaohs became invisible. A superpower does not evaporate from memory by accident. Someone stops telling the story. In the chaos that swallowed the Bronze Age, the people who might have remembered Hattusa were themselves scattered and rewritten by cultures with no interest in preserving what came before. We know them now only because 30,000 clay tablets survived the fire that was supposed to end them, baked hard by the very flames meant to silence them forever. How does an empire that faced Egypt to a standstill fall so completely out of history that the Bible reduces it to a name in a list? What else burned in Hattusa that we will never read? And how many other lost superpowers are still lying under unmarked hillsides waiting for someone to think to dig? The lion gates of Hattusa stood watch over an empty city for 3,000 years, guarding a name no living person could speak. Number 3. The Etruscans. The year is 600 BCE. You're walking through a painted tomb cut into the hills of central Italy, and the walls around you blaze with color. Dancers leap. Musicians play. Leopards pace. Men and women recline together as equals at a feast, something no Greek or Roman woman of the era was allowed to do in public. Outside, your cities are the wealthiest in Italy. Your fleet commands the western sea lanes, and just to the south, a collection of muddy settlements on 7 hills is absorbing everything your engineers are building. Those settlements are Rome. In 5 centuries, Rome will rule the world. And it will have forgotten almost everything about the people who made it possible. This is the Etruscan civilization, and it was not conquered so much as slowly digested and then deliberately allowed to vanish. The Etruscans built their League of 12 city-states across what is now Tuscany, Umbria, and Lazio from roughly the 8th century BCE, growing rich from iron and copper mining. Their craftsmen produced goldwork in a granulation technique, microscopic gold beads fused to surfaces with precision so fine that modern jewelers could not reproduce it for decades. And Rome owed them almost everything. The arch, the toga, the fasces, the bundled rods of authority that became the symbol of Roman power, carried ahead of magistrates for 500 years. Gladiatorial combat began as Etruscan funeral ritual. Roman religious practice, including the reading of animal livers and the interpretation of lightning, was inherited wholesale from Etruscan priests called haruspices. The very alphabet Rome used to write its laws, its poetry, and its conquest records came to them through Etruscan hands. The early kings of Rome, the Tarquins, were Etruscan. Rome did not invent itself. It assembled itself, piece by borrowed piece, from the civilization directly to its north. Then Rome grew strong enough to stop borrowing. Through the 4th and 3rd centuries BCE, the Etruscan cities fell one by one. Veii besieged and destroyed in 396 BCE, the others absorbed over the following century. By the 1st century BCE, the Etruscans had been absorbed into Roman citizenship, their cities Romanized, their language quietly abandoned for Latin. No massacre, no salting, just a slow, patient overwriting. Here is the tragedy. The Etruscan language was being written down constantly, in thousands of inscriptions, on temple walls, in tax records, on the lids of funeral urns. It did not die from neglect. It died from a decision. The Emperor Claudius, who married an Etruscan noblewoman named Urgulania and learned the language, spent years writing a 20-volume history of the Etruscans, the Tyrannica. It was the single most comprehensive record of their civilization ever assembled. Every word of it is gone, not burned in a famous fire, not destroyed in a conquest, simply not copied, not valued, allowed to decay until nothing remained. We can read the Etruscan alphabet today without difficulty. We can sound out every inscription on every tomb. We simply cannot understand most of what we are reading. The language is not Indo-European, related to nothing else that survived. The Pyrgi tablets, 3 gold sheets in both Etruscan and Phoenician found near Rome in 1964, gave scholars one of their few footholds, and it has not been enough. Thousands of words in a language we can pronounce perfectly and comprehend barely at all. The standard explanation is comfortable. The Etruscans were not erased, they were integrated. A genetic study published in 2021 confirmed what archaeologists suspected. The Etruscans are genetically continuous with later Italian populations. They became Romans. They survived. No erasure occurred, just evolution. But that doesn't explain the silence of the language. Genetic survival is not cultural survival. Rome preserved Greek for centuries after conquering Greece, taught it in schools, built libraries of Greek literature. The Etruscan language, tongue of Rome's own founding dynasty, was permitted to go extinct. The one man who could have saved it wrote 20 volumes that no one saw fit to copy. You do not lose a 20-volume history written by a sitting emperor through carelessness. You lose it by deciding it does not need to survive. And so the people who handed Rome its alphabet became a civilization we can read aloud but cannot understand, strangers in the language of their own descendants. Why did Rome preserve Greek and let the language of its own founders die? What was in Claudius's 20 volumes that Rome decided the future did not need to know? And how do you forget the civilization that literally taught you how to write? The dancers still feast on the tomb walls of Tarquinia, laughing in a language no living person can translate. Number 4. The Elamites. The year is 647 BCE. You're standing in the streets of Susa, one of the oldest cities on Earth, and the Assyrian army of Ashurbanipal is not looting it. It is disassembling it. Soldiers pull down the temples with organized efficiency. Scribes move behind them, recording every item removed. In the royal cemetery, teams are prying open the tombs of your ancestor kings and loading their bones onto carts. Because to Assyria, destroying a people means destroying even their dead. This is Elam, a civilization that had stood for nearly 3,000 years, rival of Babylon and Sumer, builder of one of the great ziggurats of the ancient world. And the man ordering its destruction will carve a detailed record of what he did, and why, into the walls of his own palace, because he wants the world to know. Elam was one of the founding civilizations of the Near East. From their heartland in what is now southwestern Iran, the Elamites were building cities when Egypt's pyramids were still new. The Proto-Elamite period reaches back to around 3200 BCE, making them contemporaries of the earliest Sumerian city-states across the marshes. For 3 millennia, they were the great eastern rival of Mesopotamia. They sacked Babylon. They carried the famous Law Code of Hammurabi off as a war prize and kept it in their capital for over 1,000 years, where French archaeologists found it in 1901, sitting in Susa, far from the Babylonian palace it was built for. They developed 2 writing systems of their own. Proto-Elamite, one of the oldest scripts ever identified, with over 1,000 symbols and tens of thousands of surviving tablets, resisted full decipherment for over a century. Linear Elamite, the royal script of their kings, held out even longer. Only in 2022 did a team of researchers announce a partial breakthrough, finally putting recognizable sounds to symbols that had been silent for 4,000 years. They built the ziggurat of Choga Zanbil, a 4-tiered temple complex that still rises from the Iranian plain today, one of the best preserved ancient structures in the world. Then they fought Assyria once too often. In 647 BCE, Ashurbanipal took Susa, and what followed was not a conquest, it was a program. He recorded it himself on the walls of his palace at Nineveh, in an inscription that survives and that reads, 3,000 years later, less like a military report than a checklist. He boasts that he leveled the temples and tore open their sacred groves to the sun. He records carrying off the statues of their gods. He describes opening the royal tombs and removing the bones of Elamite kings, so that, even in death, they would receive no offerings from descendants. He claims he sowed salt and thorny plants, so nothing would grow. For 55 days, he wrote, he turned Elam into a silence, in which no human voice was heard. This is not a general describing the chaos of battle. This is a king describing a policy, methodical, itemized, and proud. The standard explanation treats this as extreme but comprehensible ancient warfare. The Assyrians were the dominant military power of their age. Expansion and brutality were the instruments of imperial control, and Elam had been a persistent threat for generations. Assyria itself fell within a century, the Persians rose in the same territory, and Elamite culture folded into the new Achaemenid world. Susa became a Persian royal capital. Some continuity survived, but that doesn't explain the deliberateness of the cultural kill. There is a difference between burning a city in war and methodically removing its gods, its royal dead, its sacred trees, and its capacity to grow food. Ashurbanipal was not trying to defeat Elam. He was trying to ensure that Elam could not be remembered, could not be mourned, could not continue even as a ghost in the landscape. He salted the ground of their identity as thoroughly as the ground of their fields. And he wrote it all down, proudly, permanently, so that history would know he had done it. It is the rarest document archaeology possesses, an erasure recorded by the eraser. A how-to guide for deleting a civilization, inscribed in stone by a king who considered it an achievement worth preserving forever. How do you reconstruct a people whose conqueror bragged in writing about destroying their gods and digging up their dead? What did those temples hold that Ashurbanipal was so determined to expose to sunlight? And what does it tell us that the most detailed account we have of Elamite civilization is the boast of the man who ended it? The ziggurat of Choga Zanbil still stands in the Iranian plain, but the voices Ashurbanipal silenced have still not come back. Number 5. The Mitanni. The year is 1400 BCE. You're standing in the throne room of Washukani, capital of an empire that pharaohs beg for alliances with, an empire whose royal daughters are prized enough to marry into the house of Egypt, an empire whose horse-drawn chariots are considered the finest military technology in the world. Your king writes to the king of Egypt and calls him brother. They exchange gifts of gold and lapis lazuli and politely argue about the relative merits of each other's royal gifts. You are a subject of the Mitanni, one of the four great powers of the Bronze Age. And here is the fact that should stop you cold. 3,500 years from now, no archaeologist anywhere on Earth will be able to find the room you are standing in. Washukani, the capital city of your empire, will have vanished without a single confirmed trace. The Mitanni rose from the Hurrian people in northern Syria and upper Mesopotamia around the 16th century BCE and rapidly became a force that Egypt, the Hittites, Babylon, and Assyria all had to reckon with. We know they were a superpower because all four of those civilizations treated them as one. The Amarna letters, a cache of royal correspondence found in Egypt in 1887, include letters between Mitanni kings and the pharaohs Amenhotep III and Akhenaten, negotiating marriages, gold shipments, and the fine points of diplomatic protocol. These were not tribute letters from a vassal, they were correspondence between equals. Their military advantage was the horse. One of the most extraordinary documents to survive antiquity is a chariot horse training treatise written by a Mitanni horsemaster named Kikulai, preserved on Hittite tablets. It describes a day-by-day conditioning program for war horses in technical detail that modern equestrians recognize as sound. The Mitanni elite, the Marianu, were a chariot aristocracy whose innovations spread across the entire Near East, defining how war was conducted for 2 centuries. And then there is the strangest detail of all. In a surviving treaty between the Mitanni and the Hittites, the Mitanni kings call as witnesses a set of gods whose names are unmistakable: Mitra, Varuna, Indra, the Nasatya. These are not Mesopotamian deities. They are the gods of the Vedas, the sacred texts of ancient India. How a ruling class in northern Syria in 1400 BCE was swearing oaths by the same divine names that appear in the oldest Hindu scriptures remains one of the most genuinely puzzling questions in Bronze Age history. Then the squeeze began. From the west, the resurging Hittites pressed into Mitanni territory. From the east, the Assyrians. Their land was partitioned, their kings turned into vassals, and then into footnotes. The Assyrians had every reason to erase the memory of a former rival and were very practiced at doing so. What makes the Mitanni extraordinary in the context of this video is not their rise but the void they left. We have no Mitanni royal archive, no monumental Mitanni inscriptions celebrating their own conquests, no Mitanni king list carved on a temple wall, and we have never found Washukani. Archaeologists have searched for a century. The strongest candidate is a site called Tel Fekeriyi in northeastern Syria, but no excavation has confirmed it, and political instability in the region has kept the site largely unreachable. A capital city of a recognized great power, a city from which kings corresponded with the pharaohs of Egypt, is simply missing. It is as though London had been lost and no one could find it. The standard explanation is pragmatic. The Mitanni were a relatively brief kingdom in a brutal neighborhood, absorbed by stronger empires in the normal churn of Bronze Age politics. Their records were destroyed in war or simply haven't been found. The capital is out there somewhere under the Syrian plain. But that doesn't explain how a recognized great power leaves almost nothing of its own voice behind. Everything we know about the Mitanni comes from other people's archives: Egypt's letters, Hittite treaty tablets, Assyrian conquest records. It is as though an entire nation existed only in the files of its neighbors, its own words and monuments systematically removed. Someone did a thorough job, and the desert finished what the conquerors started. How do you lose the capital city of an empire that corresponded directly with the court of Ramesses? Why was a ruling class in Syria swearing oaths by the gods of the Rig Veda? And what would we finally understand about the Bronze Age if Washukani were found tomorrow beneath one of those unmarked mounds in the Syrian plain? The Mitanni built their power on the fastest horses in the world, and then rode straight out of history. Number 6. The Nabataeans. The year is 100 BCE. You're walking through a canyon so narrow, the sandstone walls nearly meet above your head. The rock glows red and amber in the sliver of light. The passage winds and turns, and then, without warning, the canyon opens, and you stop moving entirely. Carved directly into the cliff face in front of you is a temple 40 feet wide and over 100 feet tall, its columns and pediments cut from the living rock with a precision that would challenge a modern stonecutter with power tools. This is Petra, the rose-red city, and the people who made it are the Nabataeans, the masters of the desert, a kingdom that grew rich where nothing should grow and built where nothing should stand. In 2 centuries they will be gone, their identity dissolved so completely that not a single community on earth will call itself Nabataean. The Nabataeans began as nomadic Arab traders and ended up as the gatekeepers of the most valuable commodity the ancient Mediterranean world consumed: incense. Frankincense and myrrh, harvested in the highlands of southern Arabia, were burned in the temples of Rome, Greece, and Egypt in quantities that made them worth more than their weight in silver. The only overland route north ran directly through Nabataean territory. They taxed every caravan, brokered every transaction, and funneled the wealth of an entire trade network into their desert capital. But the incense trade was only half their genius. Their real achievement was water. They built a city of an estimated 30,000 people in a place that receives barely 6 inches of rain a year. The hydraulic engineer Charles Ortloff, who has studied Petra's water infrastructure in detail, has shown that the Nabataeans built one of the most sophisticated urban water systems of the ancient world. Ceramic pipelines ran along canyon walls. Hidden cisterns cut from the rock stored seasonal rainfall. Dams diverted flash floods into reservoirs before the water could vanish into the desert gravel. In a place that would kill the unprepared within days, they built a city that never went thirsty. At its height, Petra was cosmopolitan and visually astonishing, its monumental facades blending Greek columns with Egyptian crowns with Mesopotamian stepped altars into an architectural style entirely its own. The Nabataeans wrote in their own flowing script, a form of Aramaic. That script is not merely a historical curiosity. It is, according to the best linguistic evidence available, the direct ancestor of the Arabic alphabet used today by over 1 billion people. A civilization that vanished without heirs gave the modern world one of its most widely used writing systems. Rome arrived bloodlessly. In 106 CE, the Emperor Trajan annexed the Nabataean kingdom and renamed it the province of Arabia Petraea. No massacre, no salt, just administration. But Roman sea routes through the Red Sea slowly strangled the overland incense trade that had made Petra matter. A catastrophic earthquake in 363 CE smashed the city's water infrastructure. Trade shifted to Palmyra, and the Nabataeans, as a distinct people with a distinct identity, simply dissolved into the surrounding Arab and Byzantine world. There was no catastrophe, no last stand. They evaporated. The standard explanation is economic. The Nabataeans were a trade civilization, and when the trade moved, their purpose evaporated with it. They dispersed into surrounding cultures, their genes surviving in the populations of modern Jordan, Syria, and Saudi Arabia, their civilization ending not with a bang, but with the slow silence of irrelevance. But that doesn't explain the total erasure of identity. The Greeks stayed Greek under Rome. The Egyptians stayed Egyptian through centuries of foreign rule. The Jewish people maintained a continuous cultural identity across 2,000 years of displacement. The Nabataeans, wealthy and literate, the architects of one of the ancient world's great wonders, left no community that remembers itself as Nabataean. They mastered water in a waterless desert and then evaporated more completely than the water ever did. When the Swiss explorer Johann Ludwig Burckhardt rediscovered Petra in 1812, disguised as a Muslim pilgrim because no European could safely travel in the region, the Bedouin guiding him through the Sikh had no memory of who had carved the great facades. The builders had been gone for 15 centuries, and their name had gone with them. How does a literate, wealthy civilization that gave the world an alphabet leave behind not a single people who claim its inheritance? Where did the Nabataeans actually go, and why did their identity not survive the way so many others did? And what knowledge of desert engineering died with them that we are only now beginning to rediscover? The treasury still glows at the end of the Sikh, a monument without an owner. Number 7. The Olmec. The year is 900 BCE. You're standing in a jungle clearing on the Gulf Coast of Mexico, and you are looking up into a face, a colossal human head carved from a single block of volcanic basalt, 9 feet tall, weighing 20 tons, with full lips and a flat nose and a close-fitting helmet. The portrait of a ruler so realistic you can read the individual features. There are others like it scattered across the city, each one moved from mountains nearly 100 miles away by people who had no wheels and no draft animals. This is the world of the Olmec, the mother culture of every civilization that will ever rise in the Americas, the people who gave the Maya and the Aztec their gods, their calendar, their ball game, and possibly their writing. And one day, for reasons we still cannot fully explain, the Olmec will smash the faces off their own monuments, bury their own gods in carefully dug pits, and walk away. The Olmec flourished along the Gulf Coast from roughly 1500 to 400 BCE. Their centers at San Lorenzo and La Venta were not villages. They were cities, with monumental architecture, organized labor, long-distance trade networks that moved jade from Guatemala and magnetite from hundreds of miles away, and a social hierarchy capable of commanding thousands of workers for generations. Everything that defined Mesoamerican civilization for the next 2,000 years, the ritual ball game, the feathered serpent, the base 20 counting system, the ritual calendar, possibly the first writing in the New World, traces back to the Olmec. The colossal heads are the signature achievement, and they remain an engineering problem. 17 have been found. The largest stands nearly 11 feet tall and weighs roughly 40 tons. The basalt quarried to make them came from the Tuxtla Mountains, 80-plus miles distant, across rivers, swamps, and difficult terrain, moved by a people with no wheeled vehicles and no large animals to haul loads. The American archaeologist Matthew Stirling documented the heads in a series of expeditions in the 1930s and 1940s, and his insistence that they predated the Maya by centuries was initially dismissed. Radiocarbon dating eventually proved him right. The Olmec predated the Maya by 1,000 years. They were not a regional variant of a later culture. They were the source. Then comes the part that unsettles archaeologists. The great Olmec monuments were not left behind. Many were deliberately destroyed. Colossal heads were mutilated, features defaced with blows requiring sustained effort. Massive altars were toppled and buried in pits. At La Venta, offerings of jade and serpentine were arranged in ceremonial deposits and immediately covered under tons of clay, hidden from human eyes within the same generation that made them. This was not abandonment. This was intentional obliteration. Around 400 BCE, La Venta went silent. The Olmec as a distinct civilization was over. The standard explanation treats the burial of monuments as normal ritual practice, the ceremonial retirement of objects associated with deceased rulers or outdated religious cycles. Shifting rivers may have undermined the agricultural base of San Lorenzo. Environmental and political pressures built until the centers could not sustain themselves. The people dispersed. The Olmec did not vanish. They evolved into the cultures that came after. But that doesn't explain the violence of the defacement. A ceremonial retirement of a sacred object does not require smashing its face. The difference between respectfully interring a ritual item and hacking the features off a king's portrait is not subtle, and the archaeological record shows both. Some of what the Olmec did to their own monuments looks less like reverence and more like fury, as though someone turned violently against the symbols of an old order and wanted to make sure those symbols could not be recognized or reinstated. We do not know why. We do not even know what the Olmec called themselves. The word Olmec was applied to them thousands of years later by the Aztecs and means approximately the rubber people, a reference to the latex trees of their region. Their own name for themselves is gone, buried under the same clay as the faces of their kings. Why would a people deliberately disfigure the monumental portraits of their own rulers and bury their most sacred offerings from their own eyes? How did they move 40-ton basalt blocks 80 miles through a landscape with no roads, no wheels, and no draft animals? And what did they call themselves in the language that no one has yet read? The heads still surface from the Mexican soil, witnesses to a forgetting that began with the very hands that carved them. Number 8. The Kingdom of Kush. The year is 700 BCE. You're standing on the west bank of the Nile, deep in what is now Sudan, and behind you rise pyramids. Dozens of them, steep and narrow against a sky the color of bleached bone. These are not the pyramids you were taught about. They were not built by Egyptians. They were built by the kings of Kush. And right now those kings do not merely rival Egypt, they rule it. A Kushite pharaoh sits on the throne of the two lands, wears the double crown, governs an empire stretching from the Nile Delta in the north to the heart of Africa in the south. This civilization will eventually build more pyramids than Egypt itself. It will run the largest iron smelting industry in the ancient world. It will develop its own writing system. And when European historians sit down to write the story of the ancient world, they will leave it out almost entirely. Kush rose in Nubia, in what is now Sudan, with roots reaching back to the Kingdom of Kerma around 2500 BCE, contemporary with the Great Pyramid. By the 8th century BCE, the Kushite kings were powerful enough to march north and conquer Egypt itself. The 25th dynasty, the Black Pharaoh period, saw kings like Piye and Taharqa rule the largest empire in Egyptian history, restoring neglected temples and building monuments in a distinctly Kushite style, governing from the Nile Delta to the deep south for nearly a century. When the Assyrians finally drove them out of Egypt, the Kushites did not collapse. They withdrew to their southern capital at Meroe and built something new. Meroe became one of the largest iron smelting centers in the ancient world. The slag heaps beside the ruins are still visible today, mountains of industrial waste from furnaces that produced iron for export across Africa. Greek and Roman writers knew of Meroe and wrote about it. It was not obscure to the ancient world. And they built the pyramids, more than 200 of them, steeper and more slender than the Egyptian originals, clustered in groups across the desert plateaus of Sudan. The Kushites also broke free of Egyptian hieroglyphs and developed their own script, Meroitic, to write their own language. Francis Llewellyn Griffith cracked the phonetic values of the Meroitic alphabet in the early 20th century. We can read it aloud. We still cannot understand most of what it says. Meroe fell around 350 CE, struck by a combination of shifting trade patterns, environmental degradation, and a military blow from the rising kingdom of Aksum to the east. But the real erasure of Kush came later, and it did not come from armies. When European scholars and explorers began mapping the ancient world in the 18th and 19th centuries, they encountered the Sudanese pyramids, and, extraordinarily, many simply refused to believe Africans had built them. Theories emerged attributing them to Egyptians, to migrants, to anyone other than the Nubian people standing beside them. In 1834, an Italian fortune hunter named Giuseppe Ferlini dynamited the tops off an estimated 40 of Meroe's pyramids, looking for buried gold. He found some jewelry. He destroyed structures that had stood for 2,000 years. Imagine someone blasting the capstone off the Great Pyramid of Giza for pocket money, and the international response being a collective shrug. That is what happened at Meroe, to a kingdom the Western historical tradition had already decided not to remember. The standard explanation for Kush's absence from the mainstream story is geographical and circumstantial. The kingdom fell. The region became remote and difficult to access, and European scholarship simply focused its energy on Egypt and the classical world. Neglect, not malice. But that doesn't explain the active denial. Neglect does not produce elaborate alternative theories for who built the pyramids visible from the road. The erasure of Kush from the Western historical narrative was not an accident of geography. It was a refusal, driven by a story that insisted Africa below Egypt had no great civilizations, and every piece of evidence that contradicted that story was explained away or blown apart with dynamite. New excavations across Sudan are now restoring what was taken. But it is recovery work, not discovery, rebuilding what should never have been lost. How does a kingdom that ruled Egypt and built more pyramids than it get written out of the textbooks? Why was a man permitted to destroy 2,000-year-old monuments for personal profit? And what else has been removed from the historical record because it contradicted the story powerful people wanted to tell? The pyramids of Meroe still stand in the Sudanese desert, broken-crowned, waiting for the world to admit it knew they were always there. Number 9. The Garamantes. The year is 100 CE. You're standing in a green city in the middle of the Sahara Desert, hundreds of miles from any river or coast, and you are surrounded by fields of wheat and barley, date palms, vineyards, tens of thousands of people going about the business of an organized, literate civilization. There is almost no rain here. The surface temperature in summer can kill an unshaded person in hours, and yet the water flows, cool and constant, drawn up from channels you cannot see, cut deep beneath the sand by thousands of hands over hundreds of years. This is Garama, the capital of the Garamantes, a civilization that turned the Sahara into farmland through one of the most audacious feats of hydraulic engineering in the ancient world. Rome, whose engineers built aqueducts across 3 continents, dismissed these people as savage nomadic raiders. That dismissal was not an error, it was a choice. The Garamantes occupied the Fezzan region of southwestern Libya from roughly 500 BCE to 700 CE. Greek and Roman sources mention them in the same terms: barbarian raiders, desert nomads, a threat. That was Rome's account, and for nearly 2,000 years it was accepted without question. The truth emerged slowly through modern archaeology, particularly the work of the British archaeologist David Mattingly and the Fezzan Project, which combined ground excavation with satellite imagery to reveal what the desert had hidden. The Garamantes were not nomads. They were the architects of a hydraulic system of extraordinary sophistication. Their technology was the Fagara, a gently sloping underground channel cut through the desert rock to reach ancient aquifers, fossil water trapped in the geology from a wetter climate thousands of years earlier. Each foguera ran for miles beneath the surface, its course marked above ground by a line of vertical access shafts that look, from the air, like a trail of puncture marks stretching to the horizon. Satellite surveys have identified what appears to be hundreds of miles of these tunnels, all dug by hand, without machinery, in one of the harshest environments on the planet. The water those tunnels delivered sustained a population that may have reached 150,000 at its height. The Garamantes built walled towns, stone-built tombs and pyramidal monuments, workshops producing goods for export, and a network of trade routes linking sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world. Gold, salt, ivory, and enslaved people moved north along their roads. Luxury goods moved south. They had their own script, derived from Libyan Berber. They were, by any reasonable definition, a civilization. And then the water ran out. The Fogaras tapped fossil water, a resource deposited over tens of thousands of years that does not replenish on any human timescale. The Garamantes were mining an aquifer faster than any natural process could refill it. As the water table dropped, the tunnels ran dry, the fields failed, the cities starved. By around 700 CE, the civilization had fragmented, and the desert, which had never really been defeated, moved back in and swallowed the evidence. The standard explanation carries a parable-like neatness. The Garamantes built a brilliant civilization on a non-renewable resource, exhausted it, and collapsed. Environmental determinism. They paid the price for their own ingenuity. It is logical and well supported by the physical evidence. But that doesn't explain the erasure that came before the collapse, the one Rome engineered with words. Long before the aquifer failed, a sophisticated hydraulic civilization had already been written out of the historical record by the empire that neighbored it. Calling them barbarian nomads was not a misunderstanding. It was a political description that served Roman purposes. Nomads can be dismissed. Nomads do not require diplomatic recognition. Nomads can be raided, enslaved, and suppressed without the moral complications that come with acknowledging a peer. Rome did to the Garamantes with propaganda exactly what it did to Carthage with fire. It defined them out of existence before they were gone. When modern archaeologists finally looked past the Roman label and into the desert itself, they found a civilization of hydraulic engineers in precisely the place Rome had insisted only savages lived. 2,000 years of dismissal, overturned by satellite imagery. How did a people dismissed for 2 millennia as nomadic raiders build hundreds of miles of precision-cut underground aqueducts in solid rock? How much of ancient history is the self-serving testimony of empires describing the neighbors they preferred not to acknowledge? And what does it mean for a civilization to be erased not by conquest but by a story, told by powerful people for reasons that had nothing to do with the truth? The Fogaras run dry beneath the Libyan desert, the veins of a green kingdom that Rome preferred to call sand. Number 10. Dilmun. The year is 2000 BCE. You're standing on a low coral island in the warm waters of the Persian Gulf, and stretching in every direction are burial mounds, tens of thousands of them, swelling from the flat ground like waves frozen in earth. They are graves. This is Dilmun, the great trading nation of the Bronze Age, the place the Sumerians called the land of the living, where the gods granted immortality. Right now, it is the essential commercial crossroads between the 2 greatest civilizations of the age. In 1,000 years, its name will survive only in the oldest story ever written, half remembered by everyone, understood by no one. Dilmun was centered on the island of Bahrain and the adjacent Arabian coast, and flourished from around 3000 BCE as the commercial hinge between Mesopotamia to the northwest and the Indus Valley civilization to the east. It sat in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, and it grew wealthy from that position alone. Copper from the mines of Oman moved through Dilmun's harbors into Sumerian workshops. Carnelian beads and hardwood timber from the Indus moved through in the other direction. Grain and wool and textiles from Sumer completed the circuit. Standardized weights found on Bahrain precisely match the weight standards used in the Indus cities 1,000 miles to the east. Physical proof of a trading system so tightly integrated it required coordinated measurement across an ocean. To the Sumerians, Dilmun was not merely a market, it was sacred. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest great work of literature on earth, it is to Dilmun that the flood survivor Utnapishtim is taken to live beyond death. A real trading island in the Persian Gulf had become the Mesopotamian conception of paradise, a place so abundant, so untouched by suffering, that the gods themselves chose to rest there. The archaeology is staggering in scale. Bahrain holds one of the largest ancient cemeteries in the world, originally more than 100,000 burial mounds blanketing the island's surface. The Danish archaeologist Geoffrey Bibby led expeditions in the 1950s and 1960s that identified Dilmun's cities for the first time, excavating the Great Tell of Qalat al-Bahrain and the repeatedly rebuilt temple complex at Barbar, revealing a wealthy, organized society sustained by 2,000 years of profitable trade. Then, the Indus Valley civilization declined. Between roughly 1900 and 1700 BCE, the great cities of the Indus emptied. The eastern half of Dilmun's trade network collapsed. A crossroads with one road cut loses its reason to exist. The island remained inhabited, passing under the control of Babylon, then Assyria, then the Persian Empire, each new power treating Dilmun as a useful outpost rather than a partner, a waypoint rather than a destination. The name slipped from the records of the living and survived only in the mythology of the dead, the paradise in a poem, the land of the living that no one any longer lived in. The standard explanation is coldly economic. Trade hubs rise on commerce and fall when the commerce ends. When the Indus partner collapsed, Dilmun's function disappeared, and without a function there was no reason for grandeur, no villain, just the silent arithmetic of a broken supply chain. But that doesn't explain why a place that the Sumerians considered the home of the gods was allowed to become a footnote so thoroughly that it required Danish archaeologists with modern excavation equipment to find it 3,000 years later. Dilmun was not destroyed. It was forgotten, and the forgetting was total, which is perhaps the most revealing form of erasure of all. Not burned, not salted, not slandered. Simply left out of the story until the story moved on without it. And that thread of forgetting runs through everything in this video. Carthage burned on purpose. The Hittites lost for 3,000 years. The Etruscans absorbed until their language was permitted to die. Elam annihilated by a king who documented his own method. The Mitanni left without a capital anyone can locate. The Nabataeans dissolved without heirs. The Olmec buried under their own hands. Kush, erased by historians who preferred their Africa empty. The Garamantes deleted by a propaganda label. Dilmun forgotten because the trade moved and no one looked back. 10 civilizations, 10 different erasures. One result: history is not a record of what happened. It is a record of what the survivors chose to preserve. If that changes the way you think about the past, subscribe and hit the like button, because we dig up these forgotten civilizations every week. Tell me in the comments which of these 10 you want a full deep dive on next, and drop where in the world you're watching from. The ground beneath your feet is full of erased names. We are only just beginning to count them.